So, what does it mean to be on the path of vulnerability? Like just now, thinking about what am I going to do to rearrange the service now? Choosing to be vulnerable as a path towards gaining wisdom seems sort of counterintuitive. You know, my lived experience growing up in the Bronx in the 1970s taught me that vulnerability was a weakness. Being smaller and less physically gifted than my peers, I was subject to attack by neighborhood, how shall I say, delinquents. I was debating whether to use the word ruffians, but I guess that is an old-fashioned word. When I rode the subway into Manhattan, I was subject to random violent attacks. And when I was hanging out on the street corner, which this was before they had malls, so we used to hang out on street corners, and if I angered the wrong person for any reason, which usually ended up having to do with their ex-girlfriend liking me or something, I ended up, again, being subject to violent attacks. And all of these experiences gave me a terrible sense of fear and vulnerability. And since I did not want to be subject to violent attacks, and I did not want to stay inside my house for the rest of my life, which was not really feasible, I had to learn to protect myself. Right? I learned not to travel alone on the subway. I learned how to make allies with some of those delinquents. I learned how to negotiate with people. I learned how humor can de-escalate a situation. I learned to trust only my closest friends. I became guarded with my emotions, my speech, and my actions. My ability to protect myself literally kept me alive. The challenge, though, of these early formative experiences in our lives is when our circumstances change, often how we react to emotional triggers do not. You know, times in my young adulthood, whenever I felt vulnerable for any reason, even if it had nothing to do with my physical safety, these protective measures would pop up. Guarding my emotions as well numbed me to the entirety of the emotional side of my life. Because when you shut down your bad emotions, right, you end up shutting down all your good emotions as well. And then at some point in my life, I just realized surviving was not enough. Right? I wanted to live fully. So I started on the arduous path of vulnerability. I decided to risk the safety of being accepted, to risk the safety of being successful, as defined in the world I lived in, or to risk the safety of certainty, no matter how limiting that was. It was Unitarian Universalism that provided the environment and the community in which to be vulnerable, to figure out who I was, and more importantly, how I wanted to live in the world. You know, one of the most important lessons I learned from Unitarian Universalism was to discern what my values were and why they were important to me. You know, once I determined my values, I knew what I was going to risk. Whereas in the past, I might have felt vulnerable of losing my job if I disagreed with the owner of a company I worked for. But over time, despite being vulnerable, I gained the courage to speak out. And when I disagreed with my supervisor, especially when I thought they were doing something that was contrary or inconsistent with my values. Acting on values despite vulnerabilities does have risks, though. That is a reality. We do need to understand that there are consequences to being vulnerable. And therefore, I think it's good to take steps to limit the impact of potential consequences. But I've always, one of the ways I did this was always by living well below my means. This allowed me to be free to speak out, even if it meant losing a job. In most cases, my outspokenness, whether on business practices or personal conduct, would earn me the respect with business owners and members. Other times, when people in positions of authority were insecure, let's just say it earned me some hostility. However, in all cases, it strengthened my self-respect. And we have to be comfortable with who we are, right? We have to learn to be uncomfortable with the uncertainty of outcomes. We have to learn not to seek approval from others, but from our own conscience. Now, over time, as I discerned my values, I knew I had to find a different career. I felt very vulnerable leaving a successful career that I knew well. Instead of protecting myself, I followed a new path, and despite the risk, that choice made all the difference in my life. Once I allowed myself to be open to change, to risk the uncertain, to speak my truth, to value myself, I was able to find my way. I was talking to someone just the other day, and I said, you know, as the youngest of 3 children, I could barely get a word in at the dining room table in my household. And so it is with some irony that I now found my way to a profession where I can talk for 20 minutes and no one will tell me to be quiet. At least not yet. But once I learned actually to speak my mind on issues that were important to me, I had to find a profession where I was able to voice them and act on them without constantly feeling vulnerable. It's important to find a community where you can fully be yourself. You can question traditions, right? In Unitarian Universalism, this is the place where you can truly and fully be your whole self. You can question traditions, traditional beliefs, traditional roles that people assign to us, right? Traditional ways of doing things. Now, you don't have to discard what was still meaningful to you from your past, but you can incorporate your past and explore and include new ideas that are meaningful. It takes courage. It takes courage to do things that might cause other people you know to reject you. It requires you to be okay with failing sometimes. Not every experiment works. Some paths lead to a dead end. But even so, you need to know that your community, this community, will always support you no matter what. And that is my hope, that each of you will find that in this community, the ability to be vulnerable, to try something new, to see your life and the world in a new way. And, you know, if you see, as Catherine talked about Brené Brown, I mean, if you've ever, she has like a YouTube video that has like millions of hits, and she's written many, many books, but she often speaks about being vulnerable as a path to wholeheartedness, right? She suggests that we lean into our vulnerability. She writes, and I quote, "Vulnerability is the core of shame, fear, and our struggle for worthiness. But it is also the birthplace of creativity, joy, love, and belonging. And the way we get to that birthplace," she says, "is with courage." And she suggests we not deny our vulnerability, but rather to embrace it. She goes on to write, and I quote, "You must have the courage to tell your stories with your whole heart. The courage to be imperfect, the courage to be authentic, and let go of who you should be to be who you are. Vulnerability is not about winning and losing. It's not. It's about having the courage to show up and be seen when we have no control over the outcome. Vulnerability is not weakness. It is our greatest measure of courage," end quote. So each week I come up here in front of you and I speak my truth. In some way, I hope, in some small way, it comforts, inspires, educates, or moves you. You can always be certain, though, that it will be authentically what I am saying will be authentically what I believe in that moment. I'm always willing to be open to new learning as we expand our consciousnesses by learning together. Additionally, each week I come up here with uncertainty, never knowing who will and how much you will give for our offering each week, so that we can reach our goals as a congregation. But each week I still go forward with faith that you will be as generous as you can be as we now take our offering. For those online or on your cell phones, you can give via there's a link in the description of our YouTube channel. Let this sacred time begin. So we are certainly living in vulnerable times. We are. The state we live in is the epicenter for forces that are trying to ban free speech, to ban abortion, to ban books, and now it seems to ban diversity, equity, and inclusion. You know, when I told people I was accepting a call to a congregation in Florida, they wondered why I would pursue that path, considering all the political turmoil here. But, you know, my answer was actually very simple. First, this is where a strong Unitarian Universalist presence is needed most. It is more important now, more than ever, for us to voice and act out on our values and our vision in the larger community. Second, it is a very strong congregation, a congregation that likes to have fun together. Last night, we had a great dance and karaoke night, and just symbolic of the fun that we have as a congregation. And as well, this congregation is committed to social justice. And the third reason I gave is, well, you know, they do have great weather and beaches there too, you know. But one thing I discovered when I was on my path of vulnerability was that if I showed vulnerability and took risks, it modeled that behavior for others as well, right? When we see others taking risks, we too are more willing to take a risk. And I will tell you, I witnessed others modeling vulnerability for me last week that inspired me. Last week I went to a rally to support new college students. So for those who are unaware, the governor of Florida has appointed new conservative trustees to the New College Board of Trustees. This board then subsequently fired the president of New College and then installed a new president who received significantly higher compensation. The new board then closed the college's diversity, equity, and inclusion program. Now, the majority of speakers at this rally were students, and they are ones who are in a vulnerable position. Yet one after another, they spoke. They spoke passionately, eloquently, defiantly even, I would say, about why New College is meaningful to them and why they object to the changes that are happening. And despite the governor stating that he imagines students are receiving degrees in zombie studies, he actually said that, which personally I kind of think, how cool would that be, huh? I mean, really, because, I mean, if you think about it, it's really a study of human physiology and viruses, but that's another story. But each of these students are studying typical majors like neuroscience and sociology and computer science. I think it's telling that the governor in that same speech is calling for, and I quote, the requirement of educational institutions to prioritize graduating students with degrees that lead to high-wage jobs, not degrees designed to further a political agenda, end quote. Now, I want to say it's perfectly acceptable, right, to go to college to get a degree that will lead to a high-wage job. However, there are many non-degreed positions in the trades particularly that lead to high-wage jobs as well. And as well, I think our society needs to demonstrate the value, needs to demonstrate the higher value of some degreed positions, such as teachers and social workers, by paying them a higher wage for what they deserve for the work that they do. Yeah. For me, the purpose of education is to become educated, right? Not to get a job. I mean, that could be an outcome, but the purpose is to become educated, to create a discipline of how to learn, to think, how to think critically, right? This is exactly what New College does. Our principles call for the free and responsible search for truth and meaning. So let us make sure we keep the responsible part of searching for truth in higher education. It is not responsible to ban books and courses of study or lines of historical inquiry just because they do not fit in with your ideology. The governor claims he wants education, but not indoctrination or ideology, yet really what he wants is to indoctrinate students with his conservative ideology. The governor's new higher education plan permits the governor's appointees to review and eliminate tenure of professors at any given time. Thus, it makes academic freedom and inquiry secondary to the ideology of the governor and his appointees. The governor has called for the elimination of all diversity, equity, and inclusion programs in higher education. And these are the very values that our religion stands for. And I just always wonder, what is it that they fear about inclusion? What they fear is that the future of America looks more like the students of New College than it looks like Ron DeSantis. The one thing that makes New College stand out was on full display at that rally. They are intentionally inclusive. The students there are white, black, brown, they have purple, pink, and every color and shade and style of hair that you can imagine, right? They not only welcome, but they embrace people of all sexual orientations and gender identities. And yes, I've heard the complaint, it is true, they don't give out grades, okay? But they have high expectations of their students, and New College students have great success in the world, get into graduate school easily, win Fulbright scholarships. These kids are smart kids, and we need to recognize that, and they deserve to have a place where they want to study in the way they want to study. One of the students who was speaking said, "We are not going anywhere." Right? They've started a fund to build a grassroots support to save the intentional diversity and intellectual freedom of the school. These students put it all on the line, knowing that everybody was watching. They are worried, and legitimately, I think, worried for their safety. But still, they stay and fight for the values in which they believe, for their vision of a better world. And so I ask, what will we do? What will we do? Will we stand by while the governor puts these young people at risk for his political agenda and ambitions? What will we do? What will we risk? In what ways will we be vulnerable? And it'll take more than letter writing. Will we talk to our conservative friends and tell them we disagree, even if it might risk losing a friend, right? Will we speak out publicly against this attack on students and education? Will we march? Will we utilize our power and privilege to support free and critical education? Do we maybe have to create alternative schools where critical thinking is taught? You know, the one thing I found was very interesting. New College was actually started by the United Church of Christ in 1960. So these are religions started that school. I do not have the answer. I do not, right? The future is uncertain. But I invite you to be vulnerable. It is not without consequence. It is not. But please remember that there are also consequences to doing nothing. So I leave you now with the words of Florida State Representative from District 42, Anna Eskamani, who also spoke at the rally. And she said, and I quote, "We envision a world where joy is abundant, diversity is our strength, ideas are debated with critical thought, not partisan bias, where problems are solved, not created, where we choose calm over chaos. The world, this is the world that we want. This is the world. That is the world we envision, and that is the world we fight for every day. May it be so."